My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 49 years old. If you met me today, you'd probably think I've lived a quiet, successful life. You'd never guess that 10 years ago, I lost everything. Not because of a bad investment, not because my business failed, and not because a stranger conned me. The person who destroyed my life was my own sister. My parents passed away just 6 months apart. Like many families, we believed the hardest part was over once the funerals were behind us. All that was left was to honor their final wishes. They had prepared a will, one that I believed would bring peace to our family. Instead, it tore my life apart. In a single morning, inside a lawyer's office, I lost the house I grew up in, my parents' life savings, the land that had been in our family for generations. Everything was transferred to one person, Olivia, my little sister. I can still remember every second of that day. The attorney slid a folder across the table. Inside was a legal document bearing my name. According to those papers, I had voluntarily signed away every penny of my inheritance. There was only one problem. I'd never seen that document before, and I had never signed it. I protested immediately. I demanded an investigation. I wanted the signature examined. I wanted to know who had filed the paperwork. But everything had already been carefully planned. The signature looked authentic. The document had been notarized. There were witnesses. Every piece of evidence pointed against me. Within weeks, I lost my home. I lost my inheritance. And worst of all, I lost the trust of the people who were supposed to know me best. But losing the money wasn't what hurt the most. The real pain came from realizing the person behind it all was the little girl I had spent my entire life protecting. I worked 3 jobs so she could chase her dreams. Gave up opportunities that could have changed my own future. I postponed building a family of my own because I wanted my parents to know that Olivia would never have to face life alone. 10 years passed. Slowly rebuilt everything. A new career, a new home, a new life. And eventually learned to stop saying my sister's name. I convinced myself that chapter of my life was finally over. Until one rainy night, someone knocked on my front door. When I opened it, I barely recognized the woman standing there. It was Olivia. The expensive clothes were gone. The luxury car was gone. So was the confidence she used to wear like armor. She collapsed to her knees before I could say a word. She clung to my leg, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. Then she looked up at me and whispered the words I'll never forget. "Ethan, you're the only one who can save my daughter." Her little girl needed a bone marrow transplant, and after every test, there was only one compatible donor, me, the brother she had stolen everything from. So tell me, if you were standing in my shoe, would you save an innocent child, or would you let the woman who betrayed you experience the same unbearable loss she once forced you to endure? This is my story. I grew up in a quiet suburb just outside Denver, Colorado. It was the kind of neighborhood where every house had a front porch. Kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. Summer weekends meant backyard barbecues with the neighbors. Every winter, the entire block came together to shovel snow before anyone even asked. Everyone knew everyone. Doors were rarely locked during the day. Back then, I believed family was the one thing that could never change. My father, William Carter, was a general contractor. He wasn't wealthy, but he spent his entire life building an honest reputation. He used to tell me, "You can lose money, you can lose a job, but if you lose your integrity, you may never get it back." As a kid, I didn't fully understand what he meant. Years later, those words became the only thing I had left. My mother, Margaret Carter, taught 2nd grade at the local elementary school. She had one of those rare hearts that made everyone feel important. She remembered birthdays. She baked cookies for the mail carrier every Christmas. She even knew the cashier's kids by name at the neighborhood grocery store. To my mother, kindness was never something you measured. It was simply how you lived. We weren't a perfect family. My parents argued sometimes. Money got tight more than once. There were months when making the mortgage payment felt like climbing a mountain. But through it all, I never questioned whether I was loved. Then there was Olivia, my little sister. She was 4 years younger than me, and from the very beginning, we couldn't have been more different. I loved spending Saturdays helping Dad fix old trucks in the garage. Olivia preferred trying on dresses in front of the mirror. I spent my allowance buying tools. She spent hers on makeup and fashion magazines. I was happy with simple things. Olivia always dreamed about something bigger, something prettier, something more exciting. At the time, no one thought much of it. My parents would smile and say, "That's just how brothers and sisters are." Maybe they were right, but none of us realized those small differences would eventually grow into something much bigger. When I was 18, everything changed. My father was seriously injured in a construction accident. He shattered his leg after falling from a scaffold. The doctors told him he wouldn't be able to work for at least 8 months. Overnight, our family's main source of income disappeared. The savings account emptied faster than anyone expected. And it happened just weeks before I was supposed to start college. I still remember that evening. Dad sat quietly at the kitchen table. Stacks of unpaid bills were spread out in front of him. He stared at them for a long time before finally looking at me. "Ethan, I think you should postpone college for a year. I hate asking you this, but we don't have another choice." I looked over at Mom. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor. Neither of them could bear to look at me. I didn't argue. I didn't complain. I asked one simple question. When do I start? The very next morning, I applied for work at a construction site. During the day, I carried lumber and mixed concrete. At night, I unloaded freight at a warehouse. On weekends, I delivered furniture all over the city. For nearly 2 years, work became my entire life. Looking back, I never felt like I was sacrificing anything. I was simply doing what I believed a son was supposed to do. Because of that, my parents kept the house. Olivia stayed in the private school she loved. She never had to worry about tuition. She never had to put her dreams on hold. And honestly, that was enough for me. At least, that's what I believed. It wasn't until years later that I realized something painful. When one person quietly carries the weight of everyone else, the family eventually stops seeing it as a sacrifice. They begin to see it as an expectation. Once Dad recovered, he insisted I go back to school. So I did. I worked construction during the day and attended engineering classes at night. It took me almost 6 years to earn my degree. Most of my classmates graduated long before I did, but I never regretted taking the longer road. The day I graduated, I spotted my father standing in the very back of the auditorium. When the ceremony ended, he wrapped me in the tightest hug I'd ever received. Then he looked me straight in the eye and said, "I'm proud of you, son." It was the first time in my life I saw tears welling up in my father's eyes. Walking out of that auditorium, I honestly believed the hardest years were finally behind us. I had no idea the greatest betrayal of my life hadn't even begun. After graduating from college, I had opportunities that most people would have taken without hesitation. Several of my classmates moved to Texas, where construction was booming. Others headed to California, chasing 6-figure starting salaries. The offers were tempting, but I never seriously considered leaving. My parents were getting older. The idea of living 1,000 miles away from them never felt right. Instead, I rented a tiny office just outside downtown Denver. It wasn't much, barely 300 square feet. There was room for one desk, a couple of folding chairs, and a coffee maker that worked only when it felt like it. That little office became the beginning of my company. Back then, there were only 3 of us. Me, one carpenter, and a part-time bookkeeper who came in twice a week. Every morning, I was on the job site before 6. By evening, I was back at the office preparing estimates, returning phone calls, and trying to convince homeowners to trust a company nobody had ever heard of. Some weeks, I worked more than 80 hours. I barely slept. But I never complained, because every evening, on my drive home, I'd see my parents sitting together on the front porch, Dad reading the newspaper, Mom holding a cup of tea, watching the sunset. Those moments reminded me why I was working so hard. Every sacrifice felt worth it. Olivia's life, meanwhile, was moving in a completely different direction. She accepted a position with a major investment firm in Chicago. The salary was impressive. The bonuses were even better. Every time she came home for the holiday, she arrived in a different luxury car. First a BMW, then a Mercedes, later a Porsche. She wore designer clothes I'd only ever seen in magazine advertisements. Mom couldn't stop smiling whenever Olivia walked through the front door. "My little girl has done so well," she'd say. And honestly, I agreed. I was proud of her. I never envied her success. In fact, whenever Olivia bought a new car, she gave her old one to our parents. Dad drove one of her hand-me-down SUVs for nearly 4 years. That gesture convinced me of something. No matter how successful Olivia became, she still cared about family. Looking back, I realized I mistook generosity for loyalty. One evening, Dad invited me over for coffee. He had already poured 2 mugs before I arrived. We sat quietly at the kitchen table for a while. Then he looked at me and asked, "Ethan, if something ever happens to your mother and me, will you promise me one thing?" I smiled. "Of course. Will you always look after your sister?" I actually laughed. "Dad, Olivia makes more money than I do. I think she'll be just fine." He slowly shook his head. "I'm not talking about money. There will come a day when family is worth more than anything you'll ever own." I didn't think much about it. I simply nodded. "I promise." At the time, it felt like the easiest promise I'd ever made. Years later, it became the hardest one to live with. A few years passed. Then Mom started forgetting little things. At first, it didn't seem serious. She'd misplace her keys, miss doctor's appointments, forget where she'd left her reading glasses. But eventually, she forgot recipes she'd been cooking for 30 years. Then she started repeating the same conversation without realizing she'd already told the story. The diagnosis came a few weeks later, early-stage Alzheimer's disease. Everything changed after that. Almost every day, I stopped by my parents' house. I drove Mom to her appointments, picked up prescriptions, took Dad grocery shopping, fixed anything around the house that broke. If they needed something, I was there. Olivia called often. She asked how Mom was doing. She sent money whenever I refused to let my parents pay their medical bills. But coming home, that happened less and less. There was always another excuse. I'm buried in a project. Oh, come after the quarter ends. Next month, I promise. Then next month became the month after that. And then another. Before anyone realized, the years had slipped away. One Sunday afternoon, I was mowing the lawn at my parents' house. Dad stepped outside and watched me for a moment. Then he said something completely unexpected. Your mother and I met with our attorney this week. I shut off the mower. Everything okay? He smiled. Everything's fine. We're just getting older, and there are certain things responsible people should prepare before it's too late. I knew exactly what he meant. I didn't want to have that conversation, but Dad continued anyway. We finalized our will. He looked me in the eye. Everything will be divided equally. You and Olivia. 50-50. I shrugged. I don't really care about the inheritance. As long as you and Mom are healthy, that's enough for me. Dad smiled. He rested his hand on my shoulder. I know. That's exactly why I've never worried about you. Then he looked toward the house we'd called home for so many years. His voice grew quieter. The only thing I worry about is that after we're gone, you and your sister stay a family. I wish I had known. That would be one of the last serious conversations we'd ever have. Less than 2 years later, my father died suddenly from a massive heart attack. 6 months after that, my mother passed away peacefully in her sleep. The silence she left behind was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Just a few days after we buried her, my phone rang. It was Olivia. Her voice was calm, almost emotionless. Ethan, the attorney wants both of us in his office on Monday. It's time to read Mom and Dad's will. At that moment, I believed I was walking into a room that would bring our family closure. I had no idea. I was actually walking toward the day my entire life would fall apart. The attorney had asked us to arrive at 9 o'clock Monday morning. I pulled into the parking lot almost 20 minutes early. The law office was located inside an old brick building in downtown Denver. My parents had worked with that firm for more than 20 years. They had handled everything, from the purchase of our first family home to the final version of my parents' estate plan. The attorney overseeing their case was Richard Bennett. He was in his early 60s, a man I'd known almost my entire life. He'd shared Thanksgiving dinners with our family. He'd attended neighborhood barbecues. To me, he wasn't just a lawyer. He was someone my parents trusted completely. When he saw me walk in, he came over and shook my hand. I'm so sorry for your loss, Ethan. There was genuine sadness in his voice. Thank you, I replied quietly. A few minutes later, Olivia arrived. She stepped out of a cream-colored Mercedes wearing a tailored designer suit and oversized sunglasses. She looked calm, almost too calm. She gave me a quick hug. I know this has been hard, she said softly, but we'll get through it. I nodded. It was the first time we'd seen each other since Mom's funeral. Despite everything, I still believed we were grieving the same parents. I still believed we would walk out of that office as brother and sister. I couldn't have been more wrong. About 10 minutes later, mẹ bạn Ben invited us into the conference room. He opened the estate file and began reading my parents' will. Everything sounded exactly as Dad had described years earlier. The family home, their retirement savings, investment accounts, the vacation property outside the city. Every asset would be divided equally, 50% to Olivia, 50% to me. I felt my shoulders relax. For the first time in months, I thought maybe life was finally becoming a little easier. Then everything changed. Mr. Bennett closed the will, reached into another folder, and removed a second document. There is one additional filing, he said. It was submitted and legally recorded before your parents passed away. I frowned. What kind of filing? He slid the document across the table. I looked down. At the top of the page, there were 4 words that immediately made my stomach drop. Voluntary waiver of inheritance. The name beneath the title read, Ethan William Carter. My heart stopped. I flipped to the last page. There was my signature, or at least a signature that looked exactly like mine. I looked up. No, I never signed this. The room fell silent. Mr. Bennett adjusted his glasses. Are you certain? I'm absolutely certain. I've never seen this document before, and I never agreed to give up my inheritance. He took a slow breath before answering. Our records indicate the document was signed before a licensed notary. There were witnesses present, and every legal requirement was properly completed. I turned toward Olivia. She hadn't reacted once. Not surprise, not confusion, nothing. "When did you know about this?" I asked. She met my eyes without flinching. "I only found out recently. I assumed it was your decision." I let out a bitter laugh. "You honestly expect me to believe I'd voluntarily hand over everything Mom and Dad worked for?" She gave the slightest shrug. "I don't know, Ethan. Only you can answer that. It was the first time in my life. I looked at my sister and felt like I was staring at a complete stranger. I asked to examine every page, every signature, every date, every stamp, every notarized seal. Everything looked flawless, almost too flawless. I want the signature analyzed," I said immediately. "I want security footage. I want to know who filed these papers." Mr. Bennett sighed. "You have every right to request an investigation." He paused. "But there's something you need to understand. The ownership transfer has already been completed. Every asset in your parents' estate is now legally titled to Olivia Carter." For a second, I honestly thought I'd misheard him. "What?" "The transfers were finalized nearly 3 months ago." 3 months. 3 months earlier, my mother had still been alive. She'd been in and out of the hospital. I had spent nearly every day at her bedside. While I was helping her fight for every extra day she had left, someone had quietly stolen everything she'd spent a lifetime building. I slowly turned toward Olivia. My voice shook. "You knew. You planned this. This was you." She didn't deny it. Not this time. She simply looked at me, then spoke in a voice so calm, it was almost chilling. "Ethan, don't make this harder than it needs to be. It's better if one person manages the estate. I know how to invest. I know how to grow wealth. You're a contractor. You build houses. I build fortunes. If the assets stayed with you, they'd never become what they could be with me." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't my little sister anymore. This was a woman, using her own success to justify stealing from her own family. I pushed my chair back so hard it slammed into the wall. "I'm taking you to court. I'll fight this until the very end." Olivia stood up as well. She straightened her jacket, looked directly into my eyes, and said something that haunted me for the next 10 years. "Go ahead and sue me. But remember one thing. In a courtroom, the truth and the evidence are not always the same thing." Then she turned around, walked out of the conference room, and never looked back. I stood there, unable to move, unable to speak. That morning, inside a lawyer's office in downtown Denver, I learned what true betrayal really felt like. Because nothing cuts deeper than being destroyed by your own family. I hired an attorney before the week was over. Not because I cared about the money anymore. I cared because I couldn't accept the idea that everything my parents had spent a lifetime building could disappear because of one forged document. My attorney's name was Daniel Foster. He specialized in estate litigation and inheritance disputes. If anyone could find a way to prove what had happened, it would be him. After reviewing every page of the case file, he sat silently for several minutes. Finally, he looked up at me. "Ethan, I believe you." He paused. "But my belief isn't evidence. And evidence is what wins cases." I frowned. "What exactly are you saying?" Daniel pushed the documents back across the desk. "The notarization is valid. The witnesses signed sworn statements. The paperwork meets every legal requirement. If we're going to win, we have to prove the waiver was forged, or prove someone committed fraud during the filing process." He leaned back in his chair. "And right now, I don't have anything that proves either." I clenched my fists. "I'm telling you the truth." "I know," he nodded. "But in court, the truth isn't enough. You need proof." That was the moment I learned something I had never wanted to believe. Truth and justice aren't always the same thing. Over the next 3 months, finding evidence became my full-time job. I tracked down the notary. He insisted I had personally appeared in his office. I requested security footage from the building. It had already been erased under the company's retention policy. I interviewed every witness listed in the file. None of them could clearly remember the man who signed the documents. They only remembered someone carrying valid identification. One by one, every door closed in my face. Then came the ruling I had feared most. The judge denied our request to freeze the estate assets while the lawsuit moved forward. That meant Olivia remained the legal owner. She was free to sell everything. And that's exactly what she did. Less than 2 weeks later, a neighbor called me. "Ethan, I thought you should know. There's a for sale sign in your parents' yard." I drove there immediately. The sign was already standing in the front lawn. A realtor was giving a young family a tour of the house. A little boy, maybe 6 years old, ran laughing through the backyard, right past the old apple tree, the one my father and I planted together when I was a child. I stood outside the front gate for what felt like forever. I couldn't bring myself to walk inside. The realtor eventually noticed me. "Can I help you, sir?" I looked at the house, then back at him. I smiled as politely as I could. I grew up here, he chuckled awkwardly, probably assuming I was being nostalgic. Then he went back to showing the buyers around. I stayed across the street, watching strangers walk through the home where every memory of my childhood still lived. It remains one of the hardest moments of my life. A month later, the house was sold. The vacation property followed soon after, then the investment portfolio. Within 6 months, everything my parents had spent decades building had been converted into cash. No one knew where the money went. No one knew what Olivia invested it in. She disappeared from family gatherings, stopped answering relatives' calls, cut ties with almost everyone she had once known. What hurt me almost as much as losing the inheritance was watching people believe her version of the story. Some relatives whispered that I was simply jealous because my little sister had become successful. Others asked, if the paperwork was fake, how did it pass every legal review? Eventually, I stopped defending myself. I realized something painful. People rarely believe the truth. They believe the version that makes the most sense to them. One night, I sat alone inside the tiny apartment I had rented after losing the down payment on the first home I'd planned to buy. The lawsuit had drained what little savings I still had. The apartment barely felt like home. Then my phone rang. Olivia. I stared at her name on the screen for nearly a minute before answering. Her voice sounded calm, almost casual. Ethan, I just wanted to tell you something. I said nothing. She continued. You should stop fighting. You're wasting your time. Lawyers aren't cheap, and you're never going to win. You should just accept reality. I listened quietly, then asked her one question. Do you ever feel guilty? There was silence, only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Finally, she answered. In business, the winner is usually the person who makes the better decision. I didn't take anything from you. I simply recognized an opportunity that you didn't. The line went dead. I lowered the phone slowly. I didn't sleep that night, not even for a minute. But by sunrise, I'd made the most important decision of my life. I was done chasing what had been stolen from me. If Olivia wanted the past, she could keep it. I would spend the rest of my life building a future she could never take away. Starting from nothing, just like I had once before. Starting over at 39 was harder than I ever imagined. I had no savings, no assets to borrow against, no family home waiting for me. The future I'd spent years planning had disappeared overnight. The only thing no one had managed to take from me was my reputation. Over the year, I'd never walked away from a customer, never broken a promise, never left a job unfinished. That mattered. Because when I needed a second chance, the people who had worked with me before were willing to give me one. I accepted every project I could find. Roof repairs, kitchen remodels, garage additions, deck replacements, anything that paid an honest dollar. Some weeks I worked 7 days straight. There were nights when I slept on the floor of a construction site, because driving home would have wasted precious time. Every dollar I earned went back into the business. I didn't borrow money. I didn't gamble on risky investments. I wasn't interested in getting rich overnight anymore. I wanted something far more valuable, a life where I'd never have to depend on anyone again. 5 years later, the company finally became profitable. 7 years later, I opened a larger office. By the 10th year, we employed more than 50 people. We weren't the biggest construction company in Colorado, but we were respected, and every employee who worked for me went home knowing they had a stable future. Eventually, bought another house. It wasn't nearly as large as the one my parents had owned, but every brick, every beam, every wall had been paid for by my own hands. No one could ever take that away from me. The strange thing was during those 10 years, I never saw Olivia again. Not once. No phone calls, no birthday cards, no holiday messages. Nothing. Occasionally, a relative would mention hearing something about her. Some said she'd moved to New York. Others claimed she'd started an investment firm. Someone else insisted she'd relocated to Europe. I never tried to verify any of it. As far as I was concerned, Olivia belonged to another lifetime, a chapter that had already ended. Until one rainy evening in late October. The storm had rolled in just after sunset. By 10 o'clock, the rain was pounding against the windows. I'd finished dinner and was sitting in my living room reading the news when the doorbell rang. I glanced at the clock. Almost 10 at night. No one ever visited that late. When I opened the door, I barely recognized the woman standing on my porch. It was Olivia. But not the Olivia I remembered. Her hair was tied back in a careless knot. Dark circles framed her eyes. She looked exhausted. Her coat was soaked from the rain. She'd lost weight. Far too much. And the confidence she'd once carried so effortlessly had completely disappeared. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, without warning, she dropped to her knees, right there on my front porch. Before I could react, she broke down. The kind of uncontrollable sobbing that leaves a person struggling to breathe. I noticed curtains moving in the neighboring houses. People were watching. I quietly said, "Olivia, please, get up." But she only shook her head. She grabbed my arm with trembling hands. "Ethan, I'm so sorry." Those 3 words were something I'd imagined hearing for almost a decade. Yet when they finally came, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel satisfied. I felt nothing. Only the strange emptiness that comes after carrying pain for far too long. I helped her inside, made a cup of hot tea. She wrapped both hands around the mug, but she couldn't stop shaking. We sat across from each other. 5 minutes passed. Neither of us spoke. Finally, I broke the silence. "Why are you here?" She lowered her head. A tear landed on the wooden table. Then another. "My daughter. She's sick." I frowned. "What happened?" "The doctors say she needs a bone marrow transplant." I nodded slowly. "Then they'll find a donor." She closed her eyes and began crying even harder. "They already looked. They tested everyone. No one matches." I wasn't a match. Her voice cracked, and before she said another word, he already knew why she'd come. She reached into her purse and carefully placed a thick medical folder on the table. "Ethan, the hospital said, close blood relatives have the best chance. I've done every test they asked for." She stopped, unable to continue. After several long seconds, she whispered the sentence that changed everything. "You're the only match." The room fell completely silent. Outside, rain continued beating against the windows. I stared at the medical records, then at the sister, who had stolen everything from me 10 years earlier. And for the first time, I really... Some debts can never be repaid with money. They can only be answered by the kind of person you choose to become.
I didn't give Olivia an answer that night. Instead, I looked at her and said, "Go back to the hospital. I need time to think." She nodded quietly. Before leaving, she turned around one last time. For the first time in nearly 10 years, I saw the little sister I used to know. The arrogance was gone, the ambition, the pride. All that remained was desperation. 3 days later, I walked into the hospital. Olivia was sitting outside the pediatric intensive care unit. The moment she saw me, she jumped to her feet. Her eyes were swollen from crying, but she didn't ask a single question. She was too afraid of the answer. I walked straight past her and into the doctor's office. "I want to begin the compatibility testing." 2 days later, the results came back. I was a perfect match. The transplant specialist looked at me and said, "If the procedure is successful, your niece has an excellent chance of making a full recovery." I signed the consent forms without hesitation. Not because of Olivia, because of her daughter. That little girl had done nothing wrong. She hadn't chosen her mother. She knew nothing about what had happened 10 years earlier. Children should never pay for the sins of adults. The transplant surgery lasted nearly 9 hours. When I finally woke up, the first face I saw was Olivia's. She was sitting beside my hospital bed, crying harder than I'd ever seen anyone cry. She took my hand. Her voice trembled. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but thank you." I looked at her. "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for her." She lowered her head. For the first time in her life, she didn't argue. She didn't justify her actions. She didn't blame anyone else. A week later, her daughter was declared out of immediate danger. She wrapped her tiny arms around me and quietly whispered, "Thank you, Uncle Ethan." I smiled. It was the first genuine smile I'd felt in a very long time. Several months later, Olivia asked if we could meet. She arrived carrying a thick folder. Inside were all the answers I'd spent 10 years searching for. She confessed everything. She had hired someone to forge my signature. She had bribed the notary. She had taken advantage of our mother's illness to quietly transfer every asset into her own name. The money from the estate had been invested in a private investment fund. For several years, she made millions. She thought she'd won. Then the market collapsed. One disastrous investment wiped out almost everything. Her husband left, her business partners disappeared, her company filed for bankruptcy, and not long afterward, her daughter was diagnosed with leukemia. Olivia looked at me through tears. I've been punished every single day. I know this is the consequence of what I did. Then she signed a sworn statement. She voluntarily turned over every document, every financial record, every piece of evidence. She cooperated fully with investigators. Within months, the people involved in forging the legal documents were indicted. The corrupt notary lost his license and was prosecuted. The middlemen were arrested, and Olivia accepted responsibility for her role. She was sentenced to prison. The day before reporting to serve her sentence, she asked to see me one last time. "Ethan, if there's another life after this one, I hope I get to be your little sister again. But next time, I won't betray you." I didn't know what to say, so I simply nodded. Sometimes, silence says everything words cannot. A year later, because of her full cooperation with prosecutors and her efforts to repay what remained of the stolen assets, Olivia received a reduced sentence. Most of my parents' estate could never be recovered, but strangely, that no longer mattered to me. I still live in the house I built with my own hands. I still run the company I rebuilt from nothing. And on quiet weekends, I take Olivia's daughter fishing, the same way my father used to take me. One afternoon, as we sat watching the water, she looked up at me and asked, "Uncle Ethan, are you still angry at my mom?" I stared across the lake for a long time before answering. Yes, I was. For a very long time. But if you carry anger forever, the person trapped inside that prison isn't the one who hurt you. It's you. She reached over and quietly held my hand. She didn't say another word. She didn't have to. At that moment, I realized something. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It simply gives you permission to stop living inside it. Some people sacrifice their entire family in pursuit of money. Only after losing everything do they discover the greatest wealth was never sitting in a bank account. It was the people who loved them without conditions. Thank you for spending your time with Veritale and staying with us until the very end of this story. If today's story moved you, please consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, and turning on notifications so you never miss another story. Every choice has consequences. Every act of forgiveness requires extraordinary courage. Every story leaves a lesson. Every lesson shapes a life. This is Veritale.